Mom, I've been busy. Stop calling me so much. That was the last thing my daughter said to me before she disappeared again, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand, listening to the silence that followed as if it might explain something it never did. I didn't argue. I didn't call her back. I just set the phone down next to the sink, turned off the faucet, and stared at the second coffee cup I had poured out of habit. It sat there untouched, the steam slowly fading, just like the space she used to fill in my life. 3 weeks later, I signed a piece of paper that would change everything she thought she knew about me. The house felt too big that morning, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. At 68, I had learned to live with silence, but there's a difference between peace and being forgotten. My name is Margaret Collins, and I used to be the center of someone's world. Now, I was just a contact in a phone that rarely rang. I walked through the house the way I always did, checking the windows, straightening things that didn't need straightening, keeping routines alive as if they still mattered to someone other than me. The clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual, or maybe I was just listening harder. I used to measure time by visits, by laughter, by the sound of my daughter Emily dropping her keys on the counter and calling out, "Mom, I'm home." Now I measured it by how long it had been since I'd heard her voice without feeling like an interruption. I opened the fridge and saw the leftovers from Sunday. I had cooked too much again. Old habits don't leave easily. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, Emily's favorites. I had set the table for two that night. Then, after waiting an hour, I quietly put one plate back in the cabinet. I didn't throw the food away. I never do. It feels too much like admitting something I'm not ready to say out loud. People think neglect is loud, that it comes with slammed doors and harsh words. But the truth is, it's quiet. It's birthdays that pass with a short text. It's holidays spent watching other families through a screen. It's learning not to expect the doorbell to ring. Emily wasn't always like this. Or maybe she was, and I just didn't see it when I was too busy loving her. I told myself she had a busy life, that work was demanding, that things would slow down eventually. I gave her reasons so she wouldn't have to give me the truth. But the truth has a way of showing up anyway, in the spaces where someone should be and isn't. That morning, I wiped down the counter, rinsed my cup, and looked at the calendar on the wall. 3 weeks since that phone call. 3 weeks of nothing. No messages. No visits. No, "How are you, Mom?" I picked up my purse, took a deep breath, and locked the front door behind me. I wasn't going grocery shopping. I wasn't going to the doctor. I was going to see a lawyer. And for the first time in years, I wasn't doing something for my daughter. I was doing something for myself. I sat across from the lawyer with my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I used to sit during parent-teacher conferences when Emily was a child, trying to appear calm even when my heart was racing. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, and everything about it felt steady, deliberate, the opposite of the uncertainty I had been living in for years. Mr. Harris spoke in a measured tone, explaining documents, options, legal terms that sounded distant at first, like they belonged to someone else's life. I nodded when appropriate, asked a few questions, but mostly I listened. It had been a long time since anyone had explained something to me with patience, without rushing, without sounding distracted. When he asked me who I wanted to designate as my primary beneficiary, I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked down at my hands and noticed how still they were. No trembling, no hesitation, just stillness. It surprised me. For so long, every decision I made had been filtered through one thought. What would Emily need? What would make her life easier? What would keep her close? But sitting there, I realized something quietly, almost gently. She had already chosen her distance. This was just me finally acknowledging it. I thought about the last time she visited. It had been over a year ago. She stayed for less than an hour, spent most of it checking her phone, and left with a quick hug that felt more like obligation than affection. I remembered standing at the door after she drove away, watching the empty street as if she might come back for something she forgot, but she never did. Mr. Harris repeated the question, softer this time, giving me space. I lifted my eyes and met his gaze. There was no judgment there, Only professionalism and a quiet understanding that people do not come to his office unless something important has already shifted in their lives. I took a breath and said, "Not her." The words did not echo. They did not feel dramatic. They simply existed, steady and final. He nodded, made a note, and moved on to the next section as if this was just another ordinary decision. Maybe for him it was. But for me, it felt like closing a door that had been left open far too long. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the afternoon light. The sun was warm, the sky clear, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the air settle around me. Nothing looked different, but something inside me had shifted in a way I could not undo. I got into my car and sat there without starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel. For years, I had waited for Emily to notice the silence she left behind. I had hoped she would call, that she would show up, that something would remind her that I was still here. But hope, I realized, is not a plan. It is a place you can get stuck in if you are not careful. I turned the key in the ignition and drove home, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, neat, quiet, unchanged. But as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, it no longer felt like a place I was waiting in. It felt like a place I was finally living in, even if I was the only one there. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, not because I had somewhere important to be, but because my body had grown used to filling empty hours. The light coming through the curtains was soft, pale, the kind that makes everything look quieter than it really is. I lay there for a moment, listening to the house. No footsteps. No voices. Just the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. It was the same silence I had known for years, but it felt different now. Not heavier. Just clearer. I got out of bed, made it neatly like I always did, and walked into the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee, only one this time, and stood by the window as it brewed. Across the street, Mrs. Jensen was already outside, watering her flowers like she did every morning at 7. Her husband joined her a few minutes later, carrying a small stool so she would not have to bend too much. They spoke quietly, smiled at each other, moved around in a rhythm that comes from years of shared time. I watched them longer than I usually did. Not with envy, not exactly, but with a kind of distant recognition. I used to have that rhythm too. I used to believe it would last forever. I sat at the kitchen table and took a slow sip of coffee. The chair across from me remained empty, but I did not look at it the same way anymore. It was just a chair. Not a symbol. Not a question. Just a piece of furniture doing exactly what it was meant to do. After breakfast, I began going through the house one room at a time. Not cleaning, not organizing, just looking. Really looking. The living room still held the same photographs, frames lined neatly along the mantel. Emily at 5 years old, missing her front teeth and smiling wide at the camera. Emily at 16, standing in her graduation gown, proud and certain of the future ahead. I picked up one of the frames and held it in my hands for a moment. The girl in the picture looked at me like she knew me, like she belonged to me in a way that nothing could change. I placed it back carefully, exactly where it had been. Memory, I realized, does not disappear just because someone stops showing up. But it also does not obligate you to keep waiting. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. It surprised me enough that I stood still for a second, as if I needed to confirm it had really happened. The sound came again, firm but not impatient. I walked over and opened the door to find Daniel standing there, holding a small paper bag in one hand. He smiled in that easy way of his, the kind that does not ask for anything in return. I noticed he looked slightly out of breath, like he had walked quickly. "I was at the store and saw these," he said, holding up the bag. "They had fresh apples, and I remembered you mentioned you liked them." I blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. No occasion. No reason. Just a small act of remembering. "Thank you, Daniel," I said, stepping aside to let him in. The house felt different with someone else in it, not louder, not fuller, just warmer in a quiet, steady way. He placed the bag on the counter and began talking about something small, the weather, the new construction down the street, nothing important. But he stayed. He listened when I spoke. He noticed when I paused. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something that settled deep and certain in my chest. Attention is not something you beg for. It is something you recognize when it is real. Daniel did not stay long that afternoon, but the quiet he left behind felt different from the one I had grown used to. It was not empty. It lingered, like a conversation that had not quite finished, like something that might continue later without needing to be forced. I stood at the counter for a while after he left, looking at the apples he had brought. They were nothing special, just a small bag from the local store, but I found myself picking one up and turning it slowly in my hand as if it carried more weight than it should. It had been a long time since someone remembered something as simple as what I liked. That evening, I sliced one of the apples and sat at the table, letting the familiar taste settle in. It reminded me of years ago, when Emily was still small and used to sit across from me with her feet swinging under the chair, asking for her slices to be cut thinner because she liked the way they curled at the edges. I could still hear her voice if I let myself. I could still see the way she would smile when I got it just right. Memory does not fade all at once. It stays sharp in certain places, catching you when you least expect it. I finished the apple slowly and carried the plate to the sink, rinsing it under warm water. The motion was automatic, practiced over decades of taking care of others. But as I dried my hands and looked around the kitchen, I began to see things differently. Not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity that had been building quietly. Every corner of this house held evidence of a life I had given fully, without keeping anything back. The cabinets I had painted myself one summer when money was tight. The curtains I had sewn late at night after putting Emily to bed. The small scratches on the table from years of homework, meals, conversations that once filled this space with noise and purpose. I had built a life here piece by piece, believing it would always remain shared. That belief had kept me waiting long after there was anything left to wait for. I walked into the living room and sat down, folding my hands in my lap the same way I had in the lawyer's office. There was no anger rising in me, no sudden burst of resentment. Just a quiet understanding that settled deeper with each passing moment. Emily had not left all at once. She had drifted, slowly, over years, each missed call and forgotten visit creating distance that eventually became permanent. And I had allowed it, telling myself stories that made it easier to accept. But acceptance is not the same as truth. The truth is simpler. People make time for what matters to them. I leaned back slightly and closed my eyes, letting that thought sit without trying to soften it. It did not hurt the way it used to. It did not need to. Pain, I realized, had already done its work. What remained now was something quieter, steadier. Understanding. I opened my eyes and looked at the room again, at the photographs, the furniture, the life that was still here even if it was no longer shared the way I once imagined. I did not feel abandoned in that moment. I felt aware. And awareness, I was beginning. To understand changes everything. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in the best possible way, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because I had stopped expecting things that never came. I woke up at the same time, made my coffee, opened the curtains, but there was a quiet shift in how I moved through each moment, as if I was no longer waiting for my life to be interrupted by someone else's attention. Daniel stopped by again 2 mornings later, this time with a small toolbox in his hand and a polite knock that carried the same steady presence as before. I opened the door and noticed the way he glanced up at the loose hinge on the screen door, something I had stopped seeing after months of telling myself I would fix it later. "Thought I could take a look at that for you," he said, already stepping forward but still waiting for my nod before entering. I stepped aside and let him in, watching as he set his tools down and began working without making a show of it. The sound of metal tightening, small adjustments being made, it filled the space in a way that felt grounded, practical, real. I stood nearby for a moment, unsure if I should say something, then realized I did not need to fill the silence. He was not there out of obligation. He was there because he chose to be. When he finished, he tested the door twice, making sure it closed smoothly before wiping his hands on a cloth and giving a small nod, as if the task itself was enough of a conversation. "Thank you," I said, meaning more than just the repair. He smiled lightly, not asking for recognition, not waiting for praise, and that, more than anything, stayed with me after he left. Later that afternoon, I found myself walking through the house again, but this time I was not looking at what had been lost. I was noticing what was still possible. The guest room that had not been used in years. The garden in the backyard that needed tending but still showed signs of life beneath the surface. Small things, quiet things, but they felt like openings rather than reminders. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at my phone for a moment before picking it up. There were no new messages. No missed calls. Just the same stillness that had once felt heavy. I placed the phone back down without hesitation. I did not need it to tell me anything anymore. Instead, I reached for a notepad and began writing a list. Not of errands, not of obligations, but of decisions. Things I had put off. Things I had assumed would wait until someone else had time for me. I wrote slowly, carefully, each word deliberate. Call the contractor about the roof. Schedule the annual checkup. Sort through the storage boxes in the attic. And then, after a pause, I added one more line. Review the will. The pen hovered there for a moment before I set it down. It did not feel like revenge. It did not feel like anger. It felt like alignment, like the outside of my life was finally beginning to match what I understood on the inside. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, not heavy, not relieved, just steady. For years, I had been adjusting myself to fit into a space that kept shrinking. Now, without forcing anything, that space was expanding again. Not because someone had returned, but because I had stopped waiting for them to. 3 days later, I returned to Mr. Harris's office with a folder in my hands, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted everything to be clear, deliberate, and final in a way that left no room for confusion later. The receptionist recognized me this time and offered a polite smile, the kind that comes from familiarity rather than curiosity, and I appreciated that more than I expected. When I sat down across from Mr. Harris again, I noticed how different it felt compared to the first visit. There was no hesitation in me now, no searching for the right words. I already knew what needed to be said. He reviewed the documents with steady precision, going through each section, explaining what would happen, how everything would be executed, what it would mean in practical terms. I listened carefully, not because I doubted the process, but because I wanted to understand every detail of a decision that had taken me years to arrive at without realizing it. When he reached the section about the primary beneficiary, he paused, giving me a moment, though he already knew my answer from before. I nodded once, confirming it without needing to repeat the words. He wrote the name down again, clearly, deliberately, and I watched the ink settle into the paper as if it carried more weight than anything else in the room. It was a simple act, just writing a name, but it marked a line I had finally chosen not to cross again. We moved on to the remaining details, secondary arrangements, contingencies, all the things that make a document complete, but none of them felt as significant as that one quiet decision. When everything was finished, he slid the papers toward me and placed a pen beside them. I looked at it for a moment, noticing how ordinary it seemed. No different from the pen I kept in my kitchen drawer, the one I used to write grocery lists or jot down reminders. But this time, it carried a different purpose. I picked it up and signed my name slowly, carefully, each letter steady, each stroke intentional. There was no rush, no pressure. Just a quiet certainty that this was exactly what needed to be done. When I finished, I placed the pen back on the desk and sat back slightly, not waiting for approval, not looking for reassurance. Mr. Harris nodded, gathering the documents and placing them into a folder with the same calm efficiency he had shown from the beginning. It is all set, he said, his voice even, professional, as if this was just another completed task. Maybe for him it was. For me, it was something else entirely. I stood up, thanked him, and walked out of the office into the late afternoon light. The air felt a little cooler than before, a soft breeze moving through the street, carrying the faint sound of distant traffic and leaves shifting on nearby trees. I paused for a moment beside my car, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the moment fully, without rushing past it the way I had rushed past so many things in my life. There was no sudden sense of triumph, no overwhelming emotion. Just a quiet, grounded feeling that settled into place. I got into the car and drove home. The same route, the same turns, but everything felt slightly sharper, more defined, as if I was seeing it without the blur of expectation. When I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment, hands resting lightly on the wheel. Nothing outside had changed. The house looked the same. The street was the same. But inside, something had shifted in a way that would not move back again. And for the first time in a very long while, that did not scare me. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, quiet and ordinary, the kind of day that usually passed without leaving any mark at all. I was in the backyard, trimming a few overgrown branches near the fence, when I heard my phone ring inside the house. I almost did not go in to answer it. For a moment, I stood there with the clippers in my hand, listening to the faint sound echo through the open kitchen window, debating whether it was worth breaking the rhythm I had settled into. It rang longer than most calls did, which was unusual, and something about that made me set the clippers down and walk inside. The screen lit up just as I reached the counter, and I saw her name. Emily. I stared at it for a second, not with excitement, not even with surprise, but with a kind of still curiosity, as if I was looking at something that used to belong to me. I picked up the phone and answered on the fourth ring. "Hello," I said, my voice steady, neither warm nor cold. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Mom," she said, her tone lighter than I remembered, almost careful, like someone testing unfamiliar ground. "How have you been?" The question settled in the space between us, simple on the surface, but carrying a weight that felt misplaced after so much silence. I leaned against the counter, my eyes drifting toward the window where the afternoon light was beginning to soften. "I have been well," I replied. It was the truth, though not the kind she was expecting. That seemed to catch her off guard. "Oh, that is good," she said quickly, filling the silence before it could grow uncomfortable. "I have just been so busy lately, work has been crazy, and I realized it has been too long since we talked." The words came easily, rehearsed in a way that sounded familiar. I had heard versions of them before, each one meant to smooth over time that had already passed. I did not interrupt. I let her speak, let her fill the space the way she always had when she needed something to sound reasonable. After a moment, she shifted slightly, her tone becoming more focused. "I was actually thinking," she continued, "maybe I could come by this weekend. Spend some time together. It has been a while since I have seen the house." The way she said it, light and casual, as if it were just another detail, made something settle quietly into place inside me. Not anger. Not disappointment. Just recognition. I glanced around the kitchen, at the cabinets, the table, the life she had stepped away from without looking back. "That sounds like a busy weekend," I said gently, not agreeing, not refusing, simply placing the words where they belonged. There was another pause, shorter this time, but sharper. "Well, I can make time," she added quickly, as if adjusting her approach. "I really want to reconnect, Mom. I think it is important." I let that sit for a moment, feeling the difference between what was being said and what had been done. For years, I had been the one trying to keep that connection alive, reaching out, waiting, adjusting myself to whatever space she allowed. Now, standing there with the phone in my hand, I realized something simple and undeniable. Timing matters. Not just when someone shows up, but why. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see me. "We will see," I said calmly. I did not need to say more. I did not need to fill the silence that followed. For the first time in a long time, the space between us did not feel like something I had to fix. It felt like something I understood. Saturday arrived with the same quiet steadiness as the days before it, but there was a subtle shift in the air, something anticipatory that I could not ignore even if I wanted to. I woke up early, not out of habit this time, but because I knew she might come. I moved through the house slowly, not preparing in the way I used to when Emily visited, not setting out extra plates or adjusting everything to look perfect, but simply going about my morning as it was. I made 1 cup of coffee. I opened the windows to let in the cool breeze. I sat at the table and let the time pass without watching the clock. When the doorbell finally rang, it did not startle me. It felt expected, like a moment that had already happened in my mind before it arrived in real life. I walked to the door and opened it to find Emily standing there, dressed carefully, her posture just a little too straight, her smile just a little too practiced. In her hand, she held a small gift bag, the kind you pick up last minute when you are not sure what else to bring. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice warm, almost overly so, as if trying to fill the space between us before it could form. I stepped aside and let her in without comment. She walked through the house slowly, her eyes moving across the furniture, the walls, the photographs, taking everything in with a quiet calculation she probably did not realize she was showing. "It looks the same," she said lightly, setting the bag on the counter. "You have kept everything so nice." I nodded once and gestured toward the kitchen. "I made coffee," I said simply. She followed me in, her movements careful, as if she was stepping into a place she no longer fully recognized. We sat across from each other at the table, the same table where I had spent years waiting for her, but this time the waiting was gone. She wrapped her hands around the mug I placed in front of her, though she did not drink from it right away. There was a pause, not awkward, not heavy, just present. "I have been thinking a lot lately," she began, her tone softer now, more deliberate. "About us. About how things have been." I watched her without interrupting, noticing the way she chose her words, the slight hesitation between them, as if she was building something carefully rather than speaking freely. "I know I have been distant," she continued, her eyes meeting mine briefly before shifting away. "Life just got busy, and I guess I did not realize how much time had passed." The explanation was familiar, but hearing it in person gave it a different shape. It was no longer something I had to interpret through silence. It was something I could see clearly for what it was. She reached into the gift bag and pulled out a small box, sliding it toward me across the table. "I saw this and thought of you," she said, her voice gentle, almost hopeful. I looked at the box but did not open it right away. Instead, I let the moment settle, letting her words sit beside the years that had come before them. Across from me, Emily waited, her expression carefully arranged, her presence suddenly attentive in a way it had not been for a very long time. And as I sat there, I realized something with complete clarity. Some gestures arrived too late to mean what they once could have. I looked at the small box resting on the table between us, then back at Emily, who was watching me with a kind of careful anticipation that felt unfamiliar, almost rehearsed. I reached forward and placed my hand lightly on the box, not opening it, just acknowledging its presence. "It is thoughtful," I said quietly, my voice steady, neither warm nor cold, just honest. She nodded quickly, as if relieved that I had not rejected it outright. "I just wanted to do something nice for you," she replied, her tone soft, searching for something more to add but not quite finding it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was clear. For years, I had filled silences like this with explanations, with reassurances, with effort. Now, I simply let it exist. Emily shifted slightly in her chair, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug again, though it had long since cooled. "I have been thinking," she said after a moment, her voice more direct now, as if she had reached the part of the conversation she had come for. "About the future. About making sure everything is in order." The words were carefully chosen, but the meaning beneath them was not difficult to understand. I held her gaze this time, not with confrontation, not with accusation, just with a quiet steadiness that did not invite avoidance. "Everything is in order," I said simply. She blinked once, caught slightly off guard by how quickly I answered. "Oh, that is good," she said, her voice adjusting again, trying to find a new path. "I just meant, it is important to plan ahead, to make sure things stay in the family." The last part lingered a little longer than the rest, as if it carried more weight than she intended to show. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the words without agreeing with them. "I have planned ahead," I replied, my tone even, unhurried. "That much is already done." There was a pause then, longer this time, and I could see the shift in her expression, the way her thoughts moved quickly behind her eyes, trying to catch up with something she had not expected. She set the mug down gently, her fingers lingering on the handle as if grounding herself. You You already took care of it? She asked, her voice quieter now, less certain. I nodded once. Yes, I said. I did. The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle her more than anything else. She leaned back slightly, studying me in a way she had not done in years, as if trying to understand when the change had happened, when I had stopped waiting and started deciding. I did not explain. I did not fill the silence with details she had not earned through presence. Across the table, Emily looked at me, and for the first time, there was no assumption in her expression, no quiet certainty that she understood her place in my life without question. There was only uncertainty. I picked up the small box and turned it once in my hands before setting it gently aside. Thank you for coming today, I said, my voice calm, final in a way that did not need to be emphasized. She nodded slowly, still processing, still searching for something to hold on to. As she stood to leave, I walked her to the door, the same way I always had, but the feeling was different now. Not because something had ended, but because something had already been resolved long before this moment arrived. When the door closed behind her, the house returned to its quiet state, but it did not feel empty. It felt settled. And for the first time, I understood that peace is not something you wait for someone else to bring. It is something you create when you finally stop giving your place away.